Good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's event about nutrition as the foundation to healthy aging. This event is part of the LaBarge Optimal Aging Initiative at McMaster University, and it's actually the seventh in a series of public talks on topics related to optimal aging organized by the McMaster Health Forum. The initiative was made possible by a very generous donation from McMaster Chancellor Suzanne LaBarge. My name is Ilana Chura. I'm the Managing Director of the McMaster Health Forum, and I'm also a member of the steering group that oversees one of the components of the ambitious agenda related to Suzanne LaBarge's vision and generous gift to McMaster, namely the McMaster Optimal Aging Portal and the Knowledge Translation Enterprise. And this is done with help and under the leadership of Susan Denberg, Associate Vice President in the Faculty of Health Sciences at McMaster University. I'd like to welcome our speaker, Heather Keller, Professor of Kinesiology at University of Waterloo and Schlegel Research Chair in Nutrition and Aging, an expert in nutrition and older adults, whom I will introduce shortly. I want to give special thanks to John Levis, the director of the McMaster Health Forum, and to the organizing committee for tonight's event, my colleagues, the forum staff team, and the forum faculty. I would also like to mention that McMaster's expertise in aging continues to grow. McMaster University aspires to be the gateway to optimal aging with a number of complementary and collaborative initiatives, including the LaBarge Optimal Aging Initiative, the Canadian Longitudinal Study on Aging, the Gilbrea Center for Studies in Aging, all that are guiding McMaster towards a leadership position among Canadian institutions in the realm of aging research and knowledge translation. Our established expertise continues to grow and becoming more widely recognized, aided by the recent launch of the McMaster Optimal Aging Portal. Some quick housekeeping notes for tonight. There will be an opportunity for questions and answers. You'll see there's a microphone in the middle of the aisle. Those participating online, welcome. You can submit your questions and comments on Twitter using the hashtag @MacAging. For those in the room, if you have a mobile phone on, we'd like to please ask you to turn them to silent mode for the duration of the event. As you've probably noticed, we will be taking photos throughout the event, and we're also recording the event so that those who couldn't join us in person tonight will be able to watch it later on the forum's YouTube channel. And that will be posted there in about 2 weeks. Sorry. And for those interested in watching the video recordings from previous events, they're available on the forum's YouTube channel. And we also have handouts at the desk listing the full roster of events on optimal aging topics that we've conducted in the last few months. They're also available on our website, mcmasterhealthforum.org. So now to the agenda. We are extremely privileged to have with us tonight Professor Heather Keller, Schlegel Research Chair in Nutrition and Aging at the University of Waterloo, as I mentioned. Through her research, Heather strives to improve the nutritional state and health of older adults, whether they live in communities or in institutions. She has developed a wide collaborative network of research in both community and clinical settings, and translating this research and knowledge to practitioners, families, and older adults is a priority for her. Professor Keller has 3 research streams: nutrition risk screening, nutrition and aging well in older adults, and nutrition and dementia. Her research programs cross the continuum of care and are focused on improving the nutritional status and food intake of older adults. As chair of the Canadian Malnutrition Task Force, Heather leads an interprofessional team focused on improving the identification and treatment of malnutrition in the acute care setting. As a scientist with the Agri-food for Health Aging Research Group, she has conducted research on improving modified texture foods and fortifying food products for residents in long-term care. She's also developed nutrition risk screening tools to support efficient screening in hospital settings and in community settings, so truly covering the continuum of care. Heather will draw on her extensive knowledge and expertise and research to provide insights to us tonight into the burden on poor food intake among older adults, and also on how food intake and the pleasure associated with eating can actually be improved. We are absolutely thrilled to have Professor Keller with us tonight. Welcome. Bye.
Thanks for that wonderful introduction. Very, very nice. Thank you very much for that. So this is a real pleasure for me. I don't get as many opportunities as I would like to actually get out into the community and talk to older adults and their families and others that are interested in aging. So it's a real pleasure to be here and part of this group in the forum, specifically McMaster. So in terms of my talk, I'm going to have a little bit of an outline. And sorry, I'm going to occasionally turn this way so that I can see the slide, but I'll move around as well a little bit too. So I'm going to first give you a sense of where I want to focus this talk. So nutrition is a huge area of science. And I'm going to just take some snippets where I have expertise and also where I think there might be interest in the audience today. And give a bit of disclaimer about what I will be talking about. I also want to talk about the balance we're trying to achieve when we're looking at food intake. And so, as alluded to in my introduction, pleasure is part of food intake, right? And we should also be looking at that, not just about nutrients to feed our body. Why is nutrition foundational to health? And so a lot of people here in this room probably think that already, but I'll just reinforce a few key things around why nutrition is so incredibly important to our bodies throughout life and especially at aging as well. How are we doing with respect to healthy eating as we age in Canada? Diet quality and what should we be eating? So we'll focus in quite a bit on that area. How does this change as we age, especially as we move into different portions of our life where perhaps we're moving towards the end of our life and food intake has a different purpose potentially at that point. How we can support nutritional health of older adults in general, and then as mentioned in the introduction, lots of questions I hope in discussion. So there we go. So my disclaimer, this is what I do, and the introduction actually did a lot of this for you and described what I do, but I'm really interested in how we get people to eat better. So I'm not a nutritional scientist who knows everything about some biochemistry of a very specific nutrient. That's not me. I'm a dietitian. And so dietitian's job is to translate that science into healthy eating for older adults. And so that's my focus for you. I might not be able to answer some of your questions if you have a biochemical question, because that's a long time ago in my history when I did that. I'm also very interested in this, back up for a minute. Also very interested in, it's not just food intake we're looking at, it's also quality of life and health. And we know from the research, well, it's taken me probably 20 years to realize this fully, but food intake is affected by the mealtime experience, how we access and utilize food, and our meal quality. And so that's what I try to do in terms of research, is looking at various areas that impact on the food intake, quality of life, and health of older adults. And as mentioned, I do work in the community, specifically trying to get older adults to improve their diets. And most of the work I've been doing in that area is through screening and awareness raising. And we'll talk about that later on in the talk tonight. Residential settings, I already mentioned, I try to do things like improving mealtime experience, training for staff, family, and volunteers about how to promote food intake in older adults living in care environments. And then how do we make sure that meal quality is as good as it can be around nutrient density and pureed food. And then finally, the hospital work. I'm more concerned with how we get the people that come into hospital who are already having significant health issues, that's why they're there. They often have nutrition problems walking in the door. How do we make sure that we recognize those problems and that they are met in the acute care setting and also when they leave the hospital, so we're not losing people between the cracks? And so I'm working with the Canadian Malnutrition Task Force in that area especially. Okay? So today I'm going to focus in a lot on community. Back again. I'm mixing up the buttons here. a lot on community. Most of my talk is going to be on community, but I'm also going to talk about the residential setting as well. Okay? Certainly can answer questions in acute care, but I have no slides and discussion on the talk part in that area. So, first off, older adults are the most heterogeneous age group that we have. Someone who's 80 who runs marathons is different from someone who is 55 who has multiple sclerosis. And we lump them all together in the same age group as older adults, assuming that they have the same concerns, the same issues, the same risk factors, and also the same nutritional needs. And so that's a bit of a problem to begin with. You can see that there's potentially some challenges with that we're assuming that all of these folks in the last 30 years of their life or more are all the same. Okay? And I want to focus in on that we move often from a state of what I call eating to live, which is where we're really interested in prevention and healthy eating, to a state of perhaps living to eat is more important. And there's this balance that goes along throughout that life, and the idea of pleasure, but also being healthful. And we have to balance this out with nutrition. Okay? I want to show you this theory. It's called the quantum health expectancy theory. There's lots of theories about how we age and why we age, and they're theories because they're not necessarily proven, but they give us a good sense of understanding and helps us to explore the issues in a different way than we would have before. And this quantum health expectancy theory is in line with what we think about sociological theories and environmental theories around aging, as well as more of the biological theories, and this is why I like it. What it says is that we're all born with a certain quantity of life at birth. And that quantity of life is based on our genetics. So if we had very long-lived parents, we're more likely to live longer, right? But it also is based on that parent's health. And so we know, for example, that women who had children during the Depression or during World War II in Europe, the health of their children is different than people that were not exposed to the similar issues around famine and poor food intake, okay? So your parental health impacts it as well as the fetal health. And so as you're growing in the womb, what you're exposed to will affect your health throughout your life. We're learning more and more about that. We now know that what your grandmother ate probably influences the grandchild's health, okay? And so this is this quantum we're trying to protect as we move through life. Where the environmental part comes in is that we can erode this or we can support it. So eroding it is easy with things like smoking, too much alcohol, sedentary living, environmental exposures like pollutants, those sorts of things. And we can also support it through healthful behaviors. And so this theory actually captures a lot about what we're seeing with aging, and this is why I like it. Some of the things we know that are modifiable, these things that are the environmental assaults or the healthful behaviors, are listed here on the right-hand side of the slide. So diet, being non-obese, moderate to no alcohol, not smoking, more active living, social interaction, positive attitude, cognitive stimulation, and limiting stress. If you look at blue zones in the world, you look at Japanese people living in remote islands, you look at the Nun study, you look at Seventh-day Adventists, these are all the things that they have. And so there's been quite a bit of research to show that these populations that are long-lived, this is what it is. So you can see a lot of it is mental, when you think about social interaction, positive attitude, but also dietary and physical. And it's not so much exercise as active living, the fact that we're moving all the time. I don't know if you heard anything in the news recently about the sedentary issue, and an hour in exercise and then you sit for 24 hours isn't actually much better than not exercising at all, right? The point is we have to keep moving all day long, and that's what these cultures often are doing, okay? So, the other thing that I want to get across today, I hope you will leave with, if you leave with one thing, it's this. We have to eat well and we have to move more, and there's absolutely no magic bullet, okay? It doesn't exist. We thought vitamin C was a magic bullet. We thought beta-carotene was a magic bullet. Some of us think vitamin D is a magic bullet. And now as we do more research, we're finding these are not magic bullets, okay? We're actually finding some of them might be detrimental to our health. We have too much of them as well. So we'll talk about that. So it's a key thing, leaving today, eat well, move more, and the things that are in bottles probably aren't very helpful, okay? So what we eat. This affects every tissue of our body throughout life. Every cell that we have in our body is influenced by what we eat. That's how incredibly vital nutrition is to our health, life, etc. Right? It affects every functioning part of our body, obviously then affects our overall health. And so when you look at research that looks at the genetic component of chronic disease versus the lifestyle part of chronic disease, it's something like a 70-30 split. This idea that nutrition and healthy lifestyles, about 70% of what we're seeing around chronic disease can be explained by that lifestyle, okay? And about 30 to 40% is based on our genes. So we know from research that immunity, healing, strength, endurance, ability to deal with stressors, genesis and progression of chronic disease, healthcare use, longevity, lots of research show nutrition impacts those things, okay? So what we eat is important. However, we also like to eat this, right? And the reality is, pleasure is a huge part of food. Right from birth to death, food is pleasure. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of the talk when we think about residential living, when people are moving towards the end of life. What is the priority here? And I would argue it's pleasure, and not so much having a hugely nutrient-dense diet. Of course, it's important to keep healthful, but at some point you know you're moving towards death. I don't care if you have ice cream 3 times a day. That's pleasure, that's important, okay? And so we have to think about the quality of life when we talk about food. Unlike smoking, I would have to argue, I don't think too many people would see smoking as quality of life, why you would do it, right? Exercise perhaps as well, but we know exercise works in terms of quality of life. Not exercising doesn't help your quality of life. Food helps your quality of life, even if it's good and bad. We have pleasure from chocolate, pleasure from French fries, right? And so it's this very challenging dynamic that we've got going on. Also, we know that these things around our health impact our quality of life hugely, right? So there's an interaction between healthful eating that improves our function, that improves our quality of life, but also I want to eat chocolate and I want to have ice cream and all that pleasure that goes with that as well. So we definitely have these tensions around eating to live and living to eat throughout our life. And the balance is the key. So, back to the balance. We're going to focus in on community living older adults first. And even within community living older adults, we have extreme heterogeneity. So we've got people that are maybe quite young, they're going all around the world traveling, healthy, having what some people call the honeymoon part of their life because they're post-retirement and having lots of fun. And we also have individuals who might be starting to have chronic disease, some limitations, but they're still trying to do their best out and about in the community. Lots of heterogeneity in that community setting that we're trying to deal with. Okay? I suspect a lot of people are interested in prevention at this stage. They want to keep the way they're at in terms of function, in terms of cognition, and that's probably why a lot of folks are here today, is this idea about prevention, right? And so a lot of people are focused in on this part of it. So a lot of the talk today is going to be on how to eat well in terms of eating to live. So, what is our evidence? And I've just selected some key evidence. There's lots of evidence, all right? And so I've just picked a few key things that I thought might be highlights for you as a group tonight. So we know, back again, this clicker. We know that limiting saturated fat, cholesterol, and trans fat will prevent cardiovascular disease. That's been known for quite a while now, right? We've known that for decades. DHA and EPA, the fish fatty acids, the omega-3s, promote cardiovascular health and improve insulin sensitivity. Relatively new research on the insulin sensitivity part, but again, we've known that for a while. Eating fish is good for us, right? The idea of increased incidence of dementia is seen with high saturated fat diets, calories and alcohol, and low intakes of antioxidants in fish and methionine and other vitamins. We also know from some recent research with the Canadian Measure Survey that older Canadians who drink at least 1 glass of milk a day do pretty well on their vitamin D. And so if anybody's interested in vitamin D, they might know that the numbers around 80 that you're trying to aim for here in nanomoles per liter in your serum, this study found that if you drank 1 or more glasses a day and you're an older adult, you got to that level. Now they probably were taking some supplements, perhaps 2 or sun exposure, but those who don't have less. So again, it's the idea of food helps to promote these key prevention in terms of chronic disease. also some evidence around frailty. So not chronic disease per se, but frailty. This is an Italian study that looked at older women, and they watched these women for 3 years. And they wanted to see what happened to these women in terms of function and disability, because that's often a concern for older adults. I want to be able to do what I want to do every day. I want to be able to walk. I want to be able to drive. I want to be able to live on my own. That's function, right? And they found that women who consumed 0.7 grams per kilogram per day of protein lost 40% of their muscle mass over time, whereas women who had the highest protein intake didn't lose that muscle. So remember that fact when we get talking about protein in a few minutes further. They also found that these women had low levels of serum vitamin D, carotenoids, selenium, zinc, B6, B12. Those also predicted disability in these women, okay? We also know, and this is Canadian research, looking at nutritional risk. So just a very basic questionnaire that identifies risk versus not. And this was in the Manitoba follow-up study with older men. And they have this huge cohort of men they followed from World War II, basically. And some are still alive. And they found that nutritional risk, independent of other things that they were collecting data on, such as the person's age and living alone and that sort of thing, they found this nutrition risk was associated with mortality. That's pretty powerful. And this is a very crude measure that we'll talk about a little bit later as well, nutrition risk. So what are older adults eating in Canada? Well, basically, not enough of the right things. And so we know from a variety of studies done in the 80s, early 90s, that were community surveys done by different provinces, that basically older adults are not eating the 4 food groups, okay? We also know if we look at micronutrients, including some minerals, we see that they're not consuming the recommended levels of these nutrients. And again, a variety of studies showing this. The more recent Canadian Community Health Survey, which was done by Statistics Canada in 2008, identified that 65% do not consume 5 servings of vegetables and fruit a day. Okay, that's pretty low when you think about it. And 34% of those older adults are at nutrition risk as well. Okay, so this idea of this concept of being at risk and what that means for your health. So that says something about we need to make some changes, I think, right? So I want to clarify what nutrition risk is, because you'll hear me use that term quite a bit tonight, and you might see it in other places as well. Essentially, it's having risk factors that can impair food intake, and if that impaired food intake goes on for a period of time, you'll start to see functional changes in the body. We look at things like body weight, for example, or we look for vitamin deficiencies, or we look for functional changes in the body. We know, for example, that people who don't have enough muscle mass because they didn't eat enough protein are going to be slower when they walk. So we look for these various ways of understanding malnutrition. These risk factors, they lead to poor food intake in older adults. And so you can think of what some risk factors might be in your own mind right now. We'll talk about some of those in just a moment. Nutrition risk occurs before we see the overt signs of undernutrition. So when weight loss starts in an older adult, that's already showing they have significant risk to get there, okay? Easier to improve nutrition risk than undernutrition, so it's better to catch it early. It's like pre-frailty. When we see someone starting to have challenges around frailty, it's better to intervene then than to wait for the full-blown situation. It's harder to reverse, right? It's commonly measured by looking at accumulation of risk factors like food intake and weight change, and it's often based on self-reported risk factors being identified by a family of the older adult. There are a variety of good tools that are developed to measure nutrition risk in older adults, and a good indicator that it is a good tool is that it actually predicts the things we think are associated with undernutrition, like mortality, morbidity, etc. Okay? Because we know nutrition impacts every cell of our body. So why does poor food intake occur? And these are the risk factors. Food apathy, so lack of interest in food. And I'm sure we've seen this in some of our friends and family members. Reduced physical ability. This could be lack of ability to carry a bag of milk home from the grocery store, or to walk in those huge grocery stores, and so you don't go very often. Or you might not have a car anymore, so it limits what you buy and what you bring home, right? Or you have a walker that limits your capacity to carry things. Restricted income. Many older adults only have old age security in the basic pensions, and that's about $1,200 a month. And if your rent is $1,000 a month, that leaves very little for food, right, and quality food. Depression, social isolation, and neglect, big parts of why people may not eat the way they should. Maybe it's lack of interest in food, maybe it's no appetite, maybe it's because they're not being exposed to others that give a range of food available in terms of food offerings. Medication use affects appetite, nausea, vomiting, etc. Cognitive impairment, dentition, and multimorbidity. All those things are risk factors for why we don't eat the way we should, especially as we age. So what is the prevalence of some of these based on the Canadian Community Health Survey? You'll see why we see 34% risk in the very same survey is probably because of these risk factors. So 42% had a low income, 44% reported disability, 54% had 5 or more medications. So older adults have these risk factors that are leading to poor intake and leading to potentially some problems around nutritional status. Okay? And this is Canada's older adults. And you have to think these surveys don't reach probably the most vulnerable people who don't answer their phone or can't hear on the phone and things like that where these surveys were done. Okay. So let's talk about the prevalence of nutrition risk then, and specifically some risk factors very focused in on food intake. And this comes from the screening tool I developed for older adults living in the community. And so these risk factors we know lead to impaired food intake and impaired nutritional status and predict mortality as well, actually. So 34% in Canada have nutrition risk. 47% describe weight change greater than 5 pounds. It could be weight gain, and it could be weight loss. It wasn't differentiated out in this slide for you here. 27% report poor appetite, 42% eat alone. See, these are risk factors. It doesn't mean they are malnourished. It means they have risks that could lead to poor food intake, that could put people into health jeopardy. Okay? In addition to those risk factors for poor food intake, we don't move enough. And this compounds it because we start to see weight increasing. And what happens when weight increases? People then try to cut back what they're eating, trying to deal with that, right? And that leads to perhaps challenges in what they're eating in terms of nutrient-dense food. Okay, so I'll walk you through that idea. So decreased physical activity starts in the 20s and 30s, and we know from that same Stats Canada survey, the Canadian Community Health Survey, that 65 plus years of age people, only 27% moved 15 minutes a day. That's not much, okay? That's self-reported moving for exercise. We begin to lose our muscle mass in 30s and 40s, about 1% per year over the age of 30. Okay, that's a lot when you think about by the time you get to 80. In addition, we see unintentional weight gain. Typically, when we lose that muscle, we replace it with fat. Okay? And so we know that older adults seem to have an increased rate of muscle loss. Is it hormonal? Is it sedentary living? Is it lack of protein in the diet? That's all sort of mixed in together, but we do see this increased rate of muscle loss with older adults. We know that the majority of older adults in the CCHS were overweight and obese. Okay? So this phenomenon is existing there. And we know that people try to cut back when they gain weight. And they may not be eating, again, the nutrient-dense diets they need, the micronutrient, you might see protein deficiency, et cetera, happening. All right? We then see, as people move into their 70s and late 70s and into 80s, we start to see lots of weight loss happening in older adults. And a lot of older adults will say to me, oh, I went into hospital and lost 10 pounds, and they think that's great. But the reality is what they've lost is some more muscle, typically organ and skeletal muscle, and that's not good. Because guess what? When your organs don't have as much mass to them, they don't work as well. Same thing with your legs and your arms, right? And so muscle loss is not a good thing. And typically rapid loss in older adults is muscle. It is not fat. And so we see this unintentional weight loss happening mid-70s, late 70s, early 80s, especially when people are not moving. And this can be quite significant in terms of how much muscle they've lost. It's estimated about 20% of people, 20% of muscle is lost in those 70 plus, and 50% of the original muscle mass that you have in your 30s is gone by the time you're 80. No wonder we see frailty, right, and functional problems with older adults. So pick up on that idea a little bit more. So what should we be eating? Again, there's no magic bullet. And you're going to say, she's going to talk about Canada's food guide. I am, because it works. You'll say, well, what about the Mediterranean diet? Well, I'll show you in a minute. What about the DASH diet? Won't talk about that, but basically it's Canada's food guide repackaged. Canada's food guide works. We know it works. I showed you the evidence that says you eat nutrient-dense diets, low saturated fat, less fat in your diet, less cardiovascular disease. That's Canada's Food Guide. It's the choices you make in Canada's Food Guide that's what's important. Okay, so we'll talk about those choices. What's important here is that lots of our diet needs to be vegetables and fruit and whole grain products, right? And a little bit of milk and meat. Key with older adults over the age of 70, 51 and 70 then again, we need more calcium and vitamin D. So we need a larger proportion of milk products than younger adults do. Okay? So the scoop on serving sizes, you're probably thinking that's way too much food. Well, they're much smaller than you think. I go to this really amazing Mennonite butcher for getting some chicken. And the chicken breasts, seriously, are this big. And there's 3 in my family, and I say package 2. I'm going to have to start saying package 1 because they're so big, right? The amount of meat that is 3 ounces is the size of the palm of your hand. That is not a large amount of meat, okay? A deck of cards would be also a good indication. And so the portion sizes we're often eating are much larger than we need, especially of some of the foods that we shouldn't be eating as much of. But think, for example, vegetables and fruit. Something we want to emphasize, half a cup of carrots is not a lot of carrots. Get out your measuring cups and you realize that's actually not that many carrots. And so if you say, oh, it's hard to get 7 fruits and vegetables in my day, actually it's not. And you start adding up the portions of that. Okay, so here's some other things, like for example, a teaspoon is the end of your thumb. So using some of those generic guides will help you to realize portions are not as big as you think. Canada's Food Guide is achievable, and most women can consume Canada's Food Guide on about 1,600 calories, okay? Which is appropriate for weight maintenance as you're aging, and if you're moving a bit, that helps as well, of course. Okay, so the Mediterranean diet, you're saying, well, what about that? Well, Heather, it's the very same thing, right? What do we see here? Lots of grains on the bottom, lots of fruits and vegetables. The only differentiation is they want you to eat a little bit less of the red meat, okay? So in Canada's Food, it doesn't differentiate what type of meat and alternatives. It just says you need 2 to 3 meat alternatives a day. Some of those could be legumes, right? Some of them could be cheese and yogurt. Some could be fish and poultry, all right? Another key difference in the Mediterranean diet is this idea of wine as a potential for improving our health in terms of cardiovascular specifically, and drinking lots of fluid. Older adults are quite prone to dehydration. Your thirst drive is not as great, and you're more likely to get dehydrated because you don't have as much muscle mass, which holds your water, and it's quite a common challenge with older adults. So, evidence on the Mediterranean style diet, not just the Mediterranean diet, because there's lots of different diets that are very similar in style, like the Okinawan Japanese, the Seventh-day Adventists. Very similar. They don't have as much omega-3 perhaps in their diet for the Seventh-day Adventists, but similar concepts, okay? So we know, associated with longevity, higher fruit and vegetable intake, low-fat dairy, poultry, grains, vegetables, and fruit. This is still Canada's Food Guide, right? Just repackaged a little bit. High antioxidant and vitamin content has been shown to be associated with longevity and is part of the Mediterranean style diet. Low glycemic index, polyphenols that affect the pathways associated with aging. This has been shown to be evident in the Mediterranean style diet. Again, the vegetables and fruit, the polyphenols from many of the vegetables and fruit that we eat. Olive oil specifically has polyphenols in it that might be beneficial to our health. There is some research in the NUN study to show that the nurses study in the States, that telomere length, which is a biomarker of aging, when you follow a Mediterranean-style diet, lots of fruits and vegetables, grain products, low-fat meat and alternatives, you have longer telomeres, which means you might have a longer life, okay? Reduced heart disease, cancer. There's this question about cognition. Perhaps Mediterranean diet might help with that. I think that's still out on debate. But there's lots of evidence to suggest that this very nutrient-dense diet, which is quite consistent with Canada's Food Guide, it's just the choices, is helpful in terms of aging. And just for you to know that in Canada, we have the Canadian Consortium on Neurodegeneration and Aging, and Team 6 is actually doing a study trying to replicate a study done in the Mediterranean region to show if the Mediterranean diet is beneficial for cognitive impairment. Okay? So we're doing some of that work in Canada as well. So let's talk about some recommendations for essential nutrients. This is the thumbnail sketch, some key things that you need to know. With aging, we do have an increased need for vitamin B6. We tend to get that quite fine in our diet. You don't have to supplement it. But just be aware that you do need more. There's some nutrients you need more of because you're over the age of 50 or over the age of 70, okay, than a younger adult does. B12 has to be watched, and the reason being is that older adults may suffer from something called atrophic gastritis, which is inflammation of the gut lining. You might have less gastric acid because you might be on medications that have influenced that. That affects B12's ability to be absorbed by your gut, okay? So you might be eating lots of B12, but your gut can't use it. And so it's worthwhile having that checked on a routine basis as an older adult, especially if you're on some key medications that can affect the acid in your stomach, all right? We know that subclinical B12 deficiency is in about 30 to 60% of older adults, okay? Vitamin D has an increased requirement for 50 plus women, and for 71 all genders in terms of males and females, okay? There's an increased requirement. Many of the minerals that are recommended from the dietary reference intake are actually lower requirements in the older adult because our size is decreased, our muscle mass specifically, and fluid content in our body is decreased. And some nutrients have lower upper limits of what's considered safe as well. An example here is phosphorus. I'm sure you all know in the room we have an increased requirement for calcium as we age. And I put in orange here, there's likely an increased requirement for protein. This is not yet seen in the dietary reference intake, but there's mounting evidence to suggest that older adults need more protein than someone who's the same body weight in their 30s or 40s because of the efficiency and use of that protein by the body. I'll walk you through that protein now. So the recommendation right now, as it stands from the Institute of Medicine, is 0.8 grams per kilogram per day. Do you remember that early slide that I talked about women with disability? They were consuming 0.7 grams per kilogram per day, and they lost muscle mass over 3 years, right? That's one of the sorts of studies that suggest maybe that's not enough protein. So by the fifth decade, we see decreased muscle mass and strength starting. We know that there's decreased protein use by the body. Again, I won't go through all the pathophysiological things that are going on there. I'm not an expert in that area, but people are saying the use of the protein is different in our body. We're also not moving as much, and we're sometimes decreasing our protein, especially for people that are starting to live alone and not cooking as much, right? They might not be eating as much protein. When you don't have stimulus, which is the exercise, and you don't have substrate, you lose the mass, okay? And so you need exercise and the substrate to go along together to stimulate muscle development. So for an older adult, let's say a male, 80 kilograms, if we try to get in 1 to 1.5 grams, which is what people are, suggesting, the higher level should not be consumed by people that might have kidney problems, of course. And if you're have kidney disease, definitely not one. You need to follow a low protein diet to preserve your kidney function. But for general older adults, 1 gram per kilogram would be a minimum that we're suggesting now. And for frail older adults, people that have lots of muscle loss, we're suggesting 1.5 grams per kilogram per day. So what that looks like is 80 to 120 grams of protein per day. And how does that roll out? Well, 1 cup of milk is about 8 grams. 2 tablespoons of peanut butter, 7 grams. Meat, fish, poultry, 20 to 30 grams for 3 ounces. That's the size of a deck of cards, okay? Eggs, 7 grams. A cup of legumes, depending on the legume, it varies, but 11 to 30 grams. And 1 cup of cooked quinoa. Sorry, I know how to say that. It fell out of my head for a minute. 8 grams. What you can see here is that you've got to eat more calories, for example, peanut butter, to get near this, right? And so there's an efficiency of protein from using animal sources because you're going to have more protein packed into that volume and calorie level in an animal protein diet, okay? So fish, poultry, milk, lean meats, etc. So you can see that there's this efficiency that happens here with that. All right. Doesn't mean people that are vegans cannot achieve this. They just have to eat more calories and a lot more of the food in terms of quantity to get to this level of protein. So, another key concept. One, there's no magic bullet. You got to move more and eat better. And secondly, you can get too much of a good thing. Okay? And so if you are taking supplements of some kind, please look at the side of the bottle to see how much is in these things. Because some micronutrient supplements, especially individual nutrient supplements, go way above what we consider the appropriate level that could then potentially lead into problems. So just to give you a rundown on that so you can see a little bit better. B12, a nutrient, this is the requirement for 71 years. I just picked that age group, okay? And when it's one number versus another, it's male versus female, okay? So you can see slightly more for males. There is no upper limit designated yet for B12. That doesn't mean there isn't one. And so for some nutrients, we didn't know there was an upper limit until people started supplementing and getting into problems. And we went, oh, that's way too much. You shouldn't be taking that much of this thing. So 20 years ago, we didn't know about some of these tolerable upper limits where you get into challenges with health because you're taking too much. So just because there isn't a maximum upper limit, or what we call the tolerable upper limit, doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So you can't just take this ad lib and not worry about it, okay? So just to show you how tight some of these safety zones are, folate, 400 micrograms is the requirement for 71 plus, but only 2.5 times that gets you to your upper limit. Folate's fortified in our diet, and then if you take a supplement on top of it that has folate in it, you could be getting too much folate quite easily. Okay. Take another one, vitamin D. A lot of people think there isn't a challenge with vitamin D. It's a wonder nutrient, right? It's the magic bullet we've been all waiting for. Well, no, it actually has some negative effects if you take too much, we're finding. So 800 international units is the recommendation for males and females over the age of 71. 4,000 is the maximum upper limit. And that's only a 5 times difference, right? And so we're seeing hypercalcemia happen in people who take very large doses of vitamin D, which is not a good thing because you don't want to calcify your tissues because then they don't work. Okay, you start to see kidney problems, etc. So there is an upper limit to nutrients. You need enough, but there is too much of a good thing. And one nutrient specifically I want to point out, magnesium, only the supplemental form is an issue. But you can buy magnesium supplements way above this value. And that's above what we recommend because you could get into health problems. Okay? So, another reason why food is best, we're finding out every day new things in food. Phytochemicals, coenzymes and enzymes, polyphenols, fiber. We didn't even talk about fiber today yet. Lots of things in food we're finding out that we didn't know 20 years ago existed because science has gotten better at finding things. And this is in food. And it's not in pills. And so food is the best way to nourish our bodies, not through pills, etc. To give you an example, we'll talk about omega-3s. So I'm not an expert in omega-3s. One of my colleagues at the University of Waterloo is, and he's part of the AHA group as well. But we know that omega-3s are good for our heart, for sure, heart, potentially good for our mind. There's some interest in that, perhaps. Potentially people are seeing even to help keep our muscle, omega-3s might be useful. And the essential fatty acid is alpha-linolenic acid. We need this. We cannot make it. We can make EPA and DPA. Actually, mother's breast milk contains EPA and DPA for infants. So we can make this, but it's rate limited. And so often people then want to supplement to get enough EPA and DPA in their body and these forms of omega-3 fatty acids. The recommendation for a dietary reference intake is only for this one though, because we know it's essential. And it's 1.1 to 1.6 grams per day. DHA and EPA, it's recommended you take about 500 milligrams a day for cardiovascular health. And so lots of people are saying 500 milligrams is good for this. And there you can see some key foods that have these in them. Okay? And so fish, for example, I think it's probably 3 servings a week of 3 ounces of fish will get you your 500 milligrams averaged out over 7 days. Okay? And so it's not as hard as you would think to get in the DHA and EPA that we need. I also want to talk a little bit about functional foods, and this is because some of my colleagues in the Agri-food for Healthy Aging group do research in functional foods. And so this is to show you there is potential. We're thinking that there are some more beneficial foods. We can enhance foods further. There's still no magic bullet, though, okay? I just want to give you a sense of the research that's being done just up the road in Guelph and elsewhere. So a functional food, by definition, is a food that may provide health benefits beyond basic nutrition. So some of these products here on the bottom we've seen with health claims, right? Those are functional foods. We put things in them or even enhance something that already was there to make it better, okay? So we've added it to the food or enhanced the content. So some of the things in terms of research that are being done, a vitamin D cheese study, so trying to increase the vitamin D content of cheese. So vitamin D was already there, or in terms of milk products, it's there. We're trying to make sure it's in cheese products as well. Spearmint tea, in terms of being an osteoarthritis potential agent. Dietary fiber in dairy products. We already know dietary fiber is good for us, right? But now putting it in other places so it's easier to get. It's really hard to get 25 grams of fiber in your diet a day to meet needs in terms of preventing colon cancer, etc. Soy protein muffins. Soy protein's got all your essential amino acids in there, complete protein. Add it to a grain product, and now we've got a boost with our protein, right? These are functional foods. So, it's never too late to improve your diet. If you're 80, if you're 70, if you're 60, you're 50, never too late. You can always improve your diet. And we know from this study that was in people that are about 70 years of age that exercise, judicious diet, behavioral therapy with a dietitian to help them change their eating behaviors, not take pills. This resulted in weight loss, improved function, heart disease markers, etc. We see this in people. There's some research back from the, I think it was the early 90s. They took people in long-term care and exercised them. So people that were in wheelchairs and had them do exercise, and they improved muscle function in people living in long-term care. So it's feasible to regenerate and to become more healthy regardless of your age, all right? So what we need to do for the public, like tonight, is raise the awareness. Raise the awareness that food and nutrition is important at all points of your life. Just because you're over 70 doesn't mean you don't need as many nutrients. And in fact, some nutrients you need more, right? We need to think about making wise food choices throughout life, but specifically with older adults, because we need less energy. Every food choice has to be even wiser than when we were younger, right? For health professionals, we have to focus in on getting them to realize this importance of nutrition. Dietitians, of course, have got it, but not every other health professional sees the importance of nutrition the way that you do in this room and the way that I do. They see it as, well, not a big deal. And we'll talk a little bit more about frailty in just a moment, and some geriatricians don't see the same level of malnutrition that I see in older adults who are frail. So we need to get our health professionals thinking about screening and identifying nutrition risk in the community. And we'll talk about a tool that you can think about using yourself. Remember, whatever you're doing on the net, whatever you're hearing from anybody, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is, right? We've had people selling stuff for a long, long time to try to make us feel better, right? And if it doesn't sound right, it probably isn't. Back when I was training as an undergraduate, it was vitamin C was the wonder thing. You guys probably remember that, right? You could take as much vitamin C as you wanted, and it was going to cure everything. Well, you go to any website now, and everybody says, nah, doesn't work. Except for the people that promote vitamin C, I suppose. But if you look at credible websites, there isn't the evidence that everybody thought there was for cancer prevention, et cetera, et cetera. It's just fallen through. And so there is no true elixir for health. It's diet and move more. So where do you go for credible evidence if you're a person in the community? Dietitians of Canada is great. Recipes, fact sheets, they have an eat tracker that actually you can put in your food what you eat, find out how many nutrients you're eating, and it compares you to this dietary reference intake for age and gender group. Great way to track what you're doing, okay? And a healthful way to see where you need to maybe improve your diet. In addition to that, we are so fortunate in Ontario to have something called Eat Right Ontario. You can call a dietitian for free and get advice on any issue. You leave your question, you leave your phone number, they do the research on it, they call you back and advise you, okay? In addition to, of course, Eat Right Ontario, many family health teams now in Ontario have dietitians. Ask for a referral if you are concerned about your diet. In addition to those credible sources, I'm going to show you the Nutri-East Screen website in just a moment. This is a place where you can go in and do that screening questionnaire that I created, but not just to raise awareness about where you can improve your diet, but it's linked to resources in Dietitians of Canada and basic advice to help you make choices that are going to helpfully improve your diet and health. Okay? Agri-food for healthy aging, where I'm a research scientist and there's other research scientists there. This is what we do. We put out knowledge translation for older adults and try to identify good science and help to get that out to the public. And so that website's there as well. This is the Nutra eScreen website, and so I'll just read it out there. If you can't see it at the top, it's cut off a bit. It's World Wide Web, nutritionscreen.ca/eScreen. And you go in and you fill out the questions, and as I say, it leads you to, tells you where you're doing well, where you can improve. It links you to some key messages to help you, and then into Dietitians of Canada, Eat Right, Ontario, other resources for recipes, etc., to help you out. You can call a dietitian as well at the end and say, hey, I did this, I wonder about this, what do you think about this, and they will help you out. Okay? So, I want to move in the last bit of my talk and talk about more vulnerable older adults living in the community as well as living in residential settings. And we certainly talk more about this when we do discussion at the end. So I would contend that, of course, we want to have good nutrition for prevention for this group, but also living to eat might become more important. And I'm sure we can all think of someone we know who's got such a poor appetite and they're living on their own and they don't eat well. Just eating anything is the goal, not necessarily the nutrient-dense diet that might be the Mediterranean style or Canada's Food Guide, etc. So living to eat might be the major issue we're dealing with this person. So having to support that diet through other things might be what we have to do to support the nutrition and quality of life. So just to give you a sense of what more vulnerable older adults look like, using that same nutrition risk screening tool that was used in the Canadian Community Health Survey, you can see some interesting problems. So 22% reported weight loss. These were older adults, actually in the Hamilton area, London and KW area. Back about 2000, 2003, we did this survey with them in person and then followed them forward for 18 months to see what happened to them. And this nutrition risk that we identified predicted mortality and ER admission and falls. Okay. We found that a lot of these older adults who are attached to services, that's how we recruited them, like Meals on Wheels programs, recreation programs for older adults that are frail, they were experiencing weight loss. They had lots of problems. They had to limit their food because of a condition they were not managing well. They said, it's difficult for me to figure out what to eat. I don't know what to eat. My husband's got this and I've got this. We're trying to manage and it's difficult. 35% had chewing difficulties. 23% had swallowing difficulties, 28% had poor appetite. So significant risks that could lead to impaired food intake and potentially nutritional problems going forward. So, what does this do? I contend, and others with me, that this is a vicious cycle that happens. And why it happens for one person versus another is varied. And so I'll walk you through that a bit. Oops, sorry. So basically, it's a cycle that goes around, and it might start with low food intake, for example. It might start with weight loss. It might start with poor appetite. So let's walk through that. Low food intake. Let's say you're a recently bereaved person. You now no longer have the structure that you had before to eat meals. You start to slip into habits where you're not eating routine meals. You then are actually changing your food intake to very convenient things that are easy to just grab out of the cupboard and eat. And it changes the nutrient quality of your diet. You've got this low food intake. I've shown you the data to support the idea that that could lead to muscle loss if you're not consuming enough protein. That then could even stimulate further poor appetite and further changes in food intake. Okay? Let's go with poor appetite. Let's say you're put on a new medication that takes it out of you and it really affects your appetite. Obviously, you change your food intake often with that, right? You don't want to eat, you have no stimulus for eating, you want to just maybe have comfort foods that might not be very nutrient dense, might not be enough energy and protein, leading to weight or muscle loss. Or you could start with muscle weight loss. Maybe you go into hospital for a knee operation, and you come out 10 pounds lighter because you were bedridden during that time frame. And we know that if you stay in bed without moving for 3 days, you lose about 1 kilogram of muscle. And so there's all these changes that can happen in hospital that are not necessarily proactive. And this is why there's lots of initiatives to get people up out of bed as soon as possible and moving. Because if we leave you in bed, you've just had a stress to the body, you're going to burn muscle and you're going to use that up. And so we have to get you moving. But if that does happen, say you've broken your leg and you're immobilized for a while at home, you lose muscle mass. Because you lose muscle mass, you actually decrease your appetite, because a lot of what we call the basal metabolic rate of the body is based on the tissues of the body needing energy. If you lose some of those tissues that burn that energy, like muscle, you're going to slow down your appetite. And that's going to affect your food intake, and then you've got this vicious cycle going on. And that, just to go back, is what we call anorexia of aging. Sorry about that. Anorexia of aging and frailty. So what do we know about residential living? We don't know enough, and I'm just actually undertaking a very large study in Canada to look at this a bit more, because we know there's some challenges and we know we need to make some improvements, not only for healthful reasons, but also for quality of life reasons with older adults. So we know that undernutrition affects about 50% of long-term care residents. And this is quite recent evidence. This group is from the States, and this one is from, I believe, Italy, not sure. We know, regardless of that prevalence, that there's negative effects of that undernutrition. You're going to see more people ending up in hospital from long-term care, often with infections. 10% of all acute care admissions in Canada are from long-term care. There's not that many people living in long-term care. About 5% of older adults live in long-term care. They're taking up 10% of those acute care beds. That's a lot, right? And so is that potentially related to nutrition and function, and also perhaps some comorbidities that get out of whack? For sure. We know that poor intake is quite common in older adults, about 1,600 calories, but even lower in persons with dementia. We know very little about retirement living. It's not regulated until recently. It's just become getting some regulations around it. But there aren't dietitians in there. There isn't the same oversight around health. So we don't know much about retirement living at all worldwide. So what is going on? Why we see poor nutrition or undernutrition or poor food intake in this group? The RIA, which I'm part of, had a think tank this past summer. We brought international leaders in this area together in Waterloo and talked about it. Why do we see such poor food intake in long-term care? What are the issues? And these are the things we identified as key targets for trying to change. So we're looking at things we can change. You'll see dementia is not on this list because we can't change dementia, right? But we can change things like social interaction. We can change the quality of food and nutrient density and sensory appeal of food, making it look nice. Pureed food is one of the things that I've done some work on. And when you talk to people that consume pureed food, they say it's the look first that gets you, right? And then the taste. And then if you get past those two things, you're okay, unfortunately. And 30% of people approximately, we guesstimate, we don't know for sure, consume modified texture foods in long-term care. Right? So really an issue with quality of life for these folks. It might be the only pleasure they have, and we've ground it up. Self-feeding difficulties, a big problem in older adults in long-term care. Ambiance. Sometimes the dining room feels like a military zone, right? Everybody's coming in and out at certain times. You can't just relax and enjoy food with your family members. Maybe family members can't even eat from the dining room with you because it's too congested and crowded. All those things make it this system of rigor, and people talk about this idea about nursing home environments being, it should be the place, it's people's home. We talk about it being home, but when you have no choices, that's not home, right? And so we need to figure that out. We need to think about staff attitude, knowledge, skills, and time. Staff want to do a good job, and they need that help. We need to give them empower them to be able to make the choices to do the right thing when it comes to mealtime, like giving people enough time to eat, for example, or giving them a little extra help, etc. Lots of oral health, swallowing, and chewing problems in people in long-term care. There's only a little bit of research out in the eastern provinces showing the level of dental decay and broken teeth in older people in long-term care. So we really don't know. In this study that I'm doing, hopefully we're going to get a better insight of that. But I suspect this is a big reason why we have poor food intake in this environment. So what can we do about it? I had a graduate student do some literature review and try to summarize it. The things that literature says we can do that work in terms of improving food intake and quality of life are these. And so these are some of the things we need to be working on towards in long-term care. Intimate dining. So rather than these huge dining rooms, have these smaller, more intimate dining areas where people can talk and not have to feel like they can't hear. It feels, for people with dementia, for example, they don't get so confused in that environment when it's more intimate and smaller. Also participatory. And this is where food safety colleagues and I sort of butt heads. You know, they don't like having residents touch the plates because they might contaminate. But you know what? If you've got someone with dementia and they were a mother of 12, they feel like they need to clear the plates. And that's what they want to do. And they walk away from the dining room and not eat when you don't give them that opportunity. So we have to figure out how to allow participation of older adults in their home in some of these roles that they want to take on. Menu planning, money for food. In this study, we're going to be examining that. Volunteers, focused staff, restorative dining. This is where actually working with older adults who have some challenges around depth perception, for example, or losing feeding skill, to teach them that through Montessori methods, for example, to get them to be able to self-feed. Flexibility. Rather than lining up for dinner at 5 and everybody going in and eating until 6 and everybody leaving again. We've got to figure out how to make dining rooms like they are in everybody else's home, where you can sit and enjoy whatever you want to do in that dining room in terms of having coffee and enjoying chatting with friends, etc. Environmental changes to support it being more home-like, getting rid of the glare, getting rid of the sharp furniture, getting rid of the heavy furniture that's hard to move around for folks to make it very accessible. The idea of individualization. This is a problem in hospital too, how to make it an individual experience, because not everybody wants peas and carrots, 10 times during the month, right? We need to individualize. And this is the problem with feeding people as a group. How do you give food to the group in limited dollar and still individualize? This is what we're dealing with. And it's in acute care, but you don't see it as much of a challenge because people leave. They don't leave long-term care in the same way, right? And so we have to figure this out. And then quality, appealing, and safe diets. And so we've done some work around period food with a food scientist, Lisa Dyser at the University of Guelph, and Katrina Steele at UHN in Toronto. We're working on this idea of how do we make food better in terms of the way it looks, the way it tastes, the way it smells, especially when it's modified. So that's what we're working on. I want to touch on this idea, though, that eating is about life, and it gives the pleasure. And at some point in all of our lives, that has to be the weighing down of the balance rather than the nutrients for health. And I don't know where that is for individuals, and we have in long-term care, again, the heterogeneous older adult. Some want to follow a very strict diet because they've followed it all their lives for their diabetes, and they don't want to give that up. But at some point, because of the frailty, the anorexia of aging that goes on, that we see towards the end of life, pleasure, I think, needs to take over. And sometimes we have to say, maybe we can deal with the diabetes with medication, and let's think about pleasure with food. And where I get that from is I had the pleasure to do a long study, 6 years, talking to families living with dementia in the community. Talked to the care partners as well as the person with dementia, every year for 6 years. And it was an amazing experience because it taught me a lot as a dietitian about food and the pleasure of food that sometimes we forget. We got caught up in the nutrients. And what they told me about when I said, don't talk to me about the food, talk to me about the eating experience as a family living with dementia. And if anybody has a family member who has dementia, this might resonate with you, but they said to me, because we're losing some of these things, we recognize now the importance of them and how vital this is to our life. And the things that they said that were vital about eating with someone else were these. Being connected. So you can imagine with dementia, you might have word-finding difficulties, you might have a hard time connecting it, in conversation. But meal times, because it's that dedicated time, you're face-to-face, one-on-one sometimes with a spouse, it's a better time to be connected for people. And sometimes the social graces stimulate and happen at mealtime when they don't happen any other time. Just to give you an anecdote out of this study, one of the very first families we talked to, the husband had severe dementia. And his wife said, he never says anything all day long. But at supper, I sit down at dinner, we have a very nice meal, and he'll say, thank you, dear. They'll say nothing else all day long. They says, thank you, dear. And to her as a caregiver, that was a huge thing for her. And you can see that there's this opportunity for connection that happens at meals. It doesn't happen in other places, typically, because of this social facilitation that we see happening. We also, that should be identity, not identify. We'll have to correct that on the slide before it goes out. That's meant to be identity. Honoring identity. And this is about, think about what I just said about long-term care, the individualization. Everybody, when you go down and go home tonight, you probably have your bowl of cereal, that's your routine, or whatever it is you have, and tomorrow morning you'll know what your routine is, right? That's honoring who you are as a person. Some people want to choose certain foods, some people have certain traditions. I bet you have your chair that you sit in, right? Yeah, we do in my house. Yeah, my chair, your chair, don't get in my chair. And you might have certain traditions like at Sunday dinner or Christmas or whatever. Those are your identity, right? And so when we go into long-term care, I'm getting down to 1 minute. I'm getting close. Don't worry, Julie. When we go into long-term care, often our identity is stripped away from us, right? And so this is a challenge, is how do we put that back in? So we need to honor identities of people, their individuality that happens through meals. And then also these families talked about this idea that meals help us to adapt to our evolving life. Because we're in this situation where we're communicating with others, it helps to deal emotionally with challenges. So I won't talk more about that, but one key thing you should know is that when you put people in front of food, and you put more people in front of food, they eat more. There's been research across age groups that you put people you know well together, and you put food in front of them, they will eat more. And so if you think about people with dementia in long-term care and they're not eating, perhaps having them sit with a family member they know, they'll eat more. And maybe someone eating with them, they'll eat more. Okay, so this research that I'm conducting right now across Canada is called the Making the Most of Mealtimes. And what I'll just briefly say is we're trying to identify some of these areas that we think impact food intake. It's a complex system when you think about long-term care, right? There's provincial regulations, there's the home itself, the staff, the resident themselves. All these things can affect how they eat food. And all those could impact how much food they eat and the pleasure they get from eating that food, and try to disentangle what we can change and what we can't change. And we call this the M3 concept, the idea that there's meal quality, meal access, and mealtime experience. And what are these things that influence that? And so the study we're doing is multi-site, cross-sectional study, 8 long-term care homes per province, 4 provinces, so 32 nursing homes. It's the largest study in the world done in long-term care. And we're doing it in Canada, which is great. We're doing the most elaborate, the most elaborate food data collection's been done again in the world. 3-day weighed food record. Very hard to do, very complex, but extremely worthwhile in terms of rich data that we'll have to understand that concept really well. So we're collecting information, for example, on food, dollar cost, how many staff training, all these things that we suspect impact food intake. And so we can figure out then, if we were to put our dollars toward what change, what should it be? Right now we don't know where we should put those dollars. Okay. And this is the team, a huge team across Canada in this work. So to recap, I think I got 30 seconds. I hope you've gotten today that a healthy, nutrient-dense diet is your best defense against aging. There's no magic bullet. Food is best. Beyond nutrients, there's other healthful components of food, including the pleasure aspect. There's many risk factors that affect choice and capacity for a nutrient-dense diet, and we need to acknowledge that and think about how in community living older adults we can improve that. For example, maybe we need to think about more Meals on Wheels programs or current dining or transportation services for older adults to meet these needs, because these are real needs. We also have to think about tipping the balance, and then sometimes when we move into a state of life where we're quite frail, there's significant anorexia of aging, maybe at that point, pleasure is more the issue that we want to be dealing with rather than the nutrient-dense diet. So there is this tension, as I talked about in long-term care specifically, that we need to be aware of when we think about food, that pleasure might be what we need to do. And I'll just give you a bit of an anecdote here. My dad died of colon cancer, but it was metastases to the brain that he died from. And he wouldn't eat much in the last 6 weeks. And as a dietitian, people were like, well, weren't you worried about that? I thought, no, he's dying. We all know he's dying. And so for him, he had dysphagia, which is swallowing problems. And so we tried to give him the things we knew he loved, and that's what we worked on. And things that we could make safe. He wouldn't choke and be disconcerted by that, but things he loved. And so that was what we rather focused in on, rather than how can we cure this or keep him around for another 2 weeks. That wasn't the point. And so I think all of us in our lives come to that realization near the end of life that pleasure is more important when it comes to food, comfort, connection, and not nutrients. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you very much, Heather. This was an absolutely excellent presentation. Thank you very, very much. Extremely helpful information. I think you all agree. I can't wait to go home and share with my husband and my son and everyone I know. Eat better. Move more. There's no magic bullet. Food is best. A lot of food for thought. To me, never too late to improve your diet. Made my day. So thank you very much, and congratulations on your absolutely amazing work. Yes. All right, so we've got about 20 minutes. We'd like to open the room for questions. There's a microphone right there in the middle. And for people, yes, for people on Twitter, don't forget, tweet your questions to us using the MacAging hashtag. So we've got the first question from Maud. What about the daily dollars for amount of money for food in long-term care? She says, big issue for registered dietitians to offer appropriate, dense, tasty, safe meal.
It's very challenging, and so this is one of the things we're wanting to look at in our study. We chose provinces, one where we knew we had the research expertise to do the research, but also we wanted to go across provinces to do the study because the food dollar comes from the provincial government for long-term care. And to get a sense of how much that difference in food dollar might impact the food quality, you have to go outside of Ontario to understand that. I think it has a large component to the food quality, and we know that budgets are extremely tight, and so you can see that we're trying to meet the needs of planning diets with Canada's Food Guide. To do that, and at $7.81, which is what the dollar is for Ontario, is challenging. And so the content of that, getting that Canada's Food Guide on the plate, we might end up having to choose less nutrient-dense or quality food to do that. That's the challenge we've got. Yeah, it's definitely a significant problem.
Great, thank you. Please don't be shy. If you have any questions, come to the mic. I have one. You've mentioned, the background of people who perhaps, in terms of their ethno-cultural background or moving to Canada, those are people who may have not been taught ever what good nutrition is. Maybe they don't know what a dietitian is. How do we handle that in Canada, and what are the educational programs available?
That's a good question, and I think Dietitians of Canada would be probably the leader in it. That one of their mandates is to try to get the public aware of healthy eating. So Dietitians of Canada would be the first place. Also in terms of Health Canada, there's a large webpage around food and nutrition. So those would be the two places I would suggest going. Everybody, I shouldn't say that, not everybody is connected to a family physician, but many Canadians are connected to a family physician, and that's probably the one key resource, especially in Ontario, because we do have this family health team system for many GP offices now. That means they're connected to a network of allied health professionals, including dietitians, to support them in their care of their patients. And so that would be another avenue to try to get that resource. The Eat Right Ontario, it is English only in terms, I believe, of most of the resources. There's some French resources on there. Nutra East Screen is only in English and French at this point, but Screen is actually in 8 languages, and so if people need to do it in other languages, it is available that way as well.
Thank you. So we have a question here, and then Heather, what I think we should do is, as people come to the mic, you can
absolutely.
just
Great.
manage the.
My question is sort of concerning the timing of when you eat your food. So I know that you mentioned a lot of how it's really important to maintain a balanced diet. How important would timing your meals, sort of arranging when you eat, how important is that in maintaining a healthy diet? And are there ways where you can use timing in order to maximize how effective your eating habits are?
I think, first off, what works for you in terms of diet is probably key. And I think a lot of our eating behaviors come from our family of origin, quite frankly. One of the eating behaviors that is quite negative is the person that would not eat all day long and then start eating at 6 p.m. at night and then keep eating until midnight. And the challenge with that is because they're often in front of a television set at that point, and the portion sizes and the types of food they're choosing may not be very healthful. Okay? And so that's one type of timing of eating that I know definitely is not good. I mean, there's research to talk about that, where people don't eat anything during the day and then they binge eat at night and it gets into weight problems, etc. I think the research is a bit conflicted about, if you put energy in at 8 a.m., is it used by 8 p.m.? If you moved around, sure it is. And the basic physiology is you put it in and you use it, the energy is used up. It doesn't matter when it's put in. Nutrients get used by the body and stored away. We're very good at that, right? And so to think that we have to have a constant supply of X nutrient all through the day, no. Our bodies are much more complex than that. They know how to store it, know how to take it out and use it where we need it. There used to be this idea about protein, and there's some recent research to suggest that's not consistent. But when I was back in an undergrad, there was this issue that perhaps protein needs to be available every 4 to 6 hours to make sure it gets thrown into the muscle the way it should be and stored there. But there's been some recent evidence to show that pulse feeding of protein at a meal will lay down muscle in older adults. And it's not just through the day that we have to be thinking about. And so there is this research around, again, taking protein as the nutrient, this idea of 20 grams per meal is the way to eat protein because you maximize laying it down in muscle. That, in some older adult research, says that isn't necessarily the case. A pulse feeding, like at lunch, of 80 grams does you just as well as if you split that 80 grams throughout the day. So I think our bodies are more complex than we think they are around the storage of nutrients and utilization. And I think the pattern that leads you to a healthful diet is more relevant than do you eat at 8 or 10, etc.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, hi, Heather. I enjoyed your talk very much.
Great.
There were several points, though, that I'd like to bring up.
Sure.
One of which is when we go shopping to the local supermarket and we have a list of what we want to purchase, we try very hard to avoid foods that have a lot of processing, a lot of additives,
Right.
colors, preservatives, flavorings, and that kind of thing. And another issue that we often reflect on is whether the food that is on display, such as what you have here, is generated from an industrial form of agriculture. In other words, it's doused with various kinds of pesticides, or whether it's organic produce, whether it's locally grown.
Right.
And the other issue is whether it's genetically modified. And I'm very sorry that our health agencies in Canada are not putting pressure on the Canadian government to ensure that there is labeling of GMOs so that the consumer knows that that's what he's getting if he's buying it. Wonder if you could comment on those.
Well, I'll comment on the local, or I should say the organic versus non-organic. And so a lot of the points you're making, we don't have a lot of research on. We certainly know that there's pesticides on food and you should wash your food well, even putting your vegetables to soak in your sink, for example, to get as much residue off, and wiping off the peppers, for example, to take that residue off again. But if you look at the research that compares the nutrient density of a red pepper that was organic versus a red pepper that was not organic, the research is not showing that the organic pepper is any better, nutrient density-wise, okay? Pesticide-wise, certainly it is, okay? But there's also other things we have to think about with organic, E. coli, and other forms of ways that we would nourish the soil in an organic farm system that could also contaminate the food. And so you know, I'm sure you've seen that in the paper too, about organic food being contaminated with bacteria because of the manure that's been used in farming. And so there's a tension here, of course, and we want our food supply to be healthy. I don't know enough about GMOs to comment on the nutritive value of that. The research that I do know is around organic versus non-organic, and as I say, the research doesn't bear out that there's difference. We do know that a piece of fruit coming from Mexico, the vitamin C, if it sits for a long period of time on the shelf, will be degraded. That can happen for organic food though too. It's the storage of it that is the issue. So if you picked a strawberry from your market, of course it's going to have higher micronutrients that don't degrade over time with oxygen and light. However, our system has gotten so good that we get fruit from somewhere south of here within 24 hours. It doesn't degrade that much anymore. It did 20 years ago, not anymore because of the speed of getting things around. So this issue about nutrient density doesn't seem to be there. Certainly around ecology and the environment and feeling good about where we're spending our dollar, of course there's an argument to be made for those points that you were talking about. So thank you.
Hi, I appreciated what you were saying about eating foods that are just food. And but my question is to do with protein, and I may be wrong, but I always have felt that it's difficult to get enough protein. And there are so many whey proteins, or those bottles of proteins, and I just wanted to hear your comment on that. Like, I know a lot of people will put them in smoothies or something like that. If we do
I will comment, yeah.
powdered protein, what kind is good, I guess?
The research tends to focus in on whey, one because it's cheap. And it was used originally in a lot of the protein powders for muscle building and stuff like that. And people realize it's an easy way to get protein in the diet compared to chicken breast, for example. And for research studies, quite frankly, it's easy, right? Because it's easier to say this amount of protein versus a chicken breast, which can vary in size and weight depending on what happens to it, right? And so that's one of the reasons why we know so much about whey, is because it's been easy to include in research, and it's been cheap, and it's been in the food supply for protein supplements for muscle building for years. So we know a lot about it. Whey is a good protein for building muscle, definitely. Other proteins are also good, all right? And so it's not just whey. And so fish, poultry, meat. There's some research suggests that other essential amino acids in things like soy are also very good. I think why we know so much about whey and why we think whey first is because of the research that's been done on it. It hasn't been done as much on some other proteins in the same way around the idea of muscle and muscle function. So I think the idea is protein, definitely. Then you want to make sure its essential amino acids are covered off in that protein. That typically means animal products and soy. Those are the essential amino acids are all in those, right? And then choose what you like.
Great, thank you.
Question from Twitter, and then the one from the audience. Sarthak on Twitter is asking, how do we ensure patients at nutrition risk are referred to dietitians by healthcare providers in hospital settings?
Great question. And so this is my Canadian Malnutrition Task Force hat I'll put on. We did a very large study across Canada that's just being published now, showing that when people walk in the door to a medical and surgical unit, a large portion of them have malnutrition. It's because they're unwell, they have disease conditions, etc. Many of them never see a dietitian. In fact, in our study, about 23% saw a dietitian of all the sample, not just the malnourished folks. And we were missing 70% of the malnourished people. So the key is we have to think about putting into place systems where there is that screening with the front intake person, the nurse typically, maybe it is another person that's doing intake of that person in acute care, to do some basic nutrition risk screening. If they put in the pile of nutrition risk, then get them onto the dietitian to then figure out, do they really have a situation here we have to work on, and get them into the process of doing that. And then at discharge, making sure that communication happens with the family, the patient themselves, and moving on into the care providers in the community. So it's a great question. Yes?
Very nice talk. You mentioned that the majority of older adults, they are overweight or obese. Mm-hmm. And for the general population, the most common way to know if you have a health weight or overweight or obese is using the BMI.
That's correct. Yeah.
For the older population, there is a different way to determine, especially given the depletion in muscle mass that you mentioned.
Great question. And I didn't talk about BMI here at all, but when people do think about BMI, and in that CCHS, they used the World Health Organization, the Canadian guidelines around overweight and obesity, which is above 25, right? And as a person who does research with older adults, I don't like that. And in fact, I sat on the Canadian guidelines way back when, and I said, you have to do something. You have to say a little notation for older adults. And if you look at the tables carefully, it says for people over the age of 65, perhaps a healthy weight is higher. And so what a lot of us use in practice and in research is between 21, 22, up to 29. That's healthy. The reason being, just think of a very basic thing. As you age, you get shorter. Your body weight doesn't change a bit, but your BMI will go up just because you got shorter. Nothing to do with your weight, right? It has to do with your height. And so it's just an index. And the research suggests that until you get over the BMI of 30 and 34 even with older adults, it's really not an issue. There's lots of research also suggests that it's unintentional weight loss is really the concern that we should have with older adults, even when they're overweight. If they get to 75 and they're overweight, it's probably not, they've done the damage already. It's not going to be any more damage because they stay at that weight. If they lose weight because they don't eat well, that's more damaging to their body. If they lose weight by healthful, judicious diet and exercise, and they keep their muscle, great, good for them. But I don't advocate weight loss for people that are overweight in their 70s if they're not willing to move and not willing to do it with a judicious diet. It's not the way to go. You're going to lose muscle mass. Good question. Thanks.
Thank you.